So I read this really interesting article which I want to kind of share with you, and it's about Martin Scorsese and loneliness. Martin Scorsese, as we know, is one of Hollywood's most legendary directors who's directed almost a dozen, maybe more, critically acclaimed films that have done well across the board, been loved by critics, done well at the box office, and essentially is a Hollywood legend. He says watching films came out of a necessity from the illness of asthma, and it came out of a loneliness, which I still have, which had to do with my mother and father, and they couldn't do anything with me, so they took me to the movies. The article goes on to talk about how loneliness is something that he still encounters to this day, and he also says something very, very interesting for an 8-year-old man, which is, he says, I still have to find out who the hell I am. Now, I'm not going to try to compare myself to someone like Scorsese, someone who spent his whole life making these films that have been seen across the world, versus myself, who hasn't once actually made a narrative of any sort. But I think what I really related to in this article was this idea that the love for film and ultimately the career that I went into came out of this place of, call it loneliness, or not being able to fit in, or not being able to understand the world around you. And I think that's such an interesting point to kind of tackle, because I feel like us as filmmakers and artists generally, when we understand the space from which we create, or we understand the environment that created the space from which we create, I feel that we can really use that to empower ourselves and empower our art. I grew up watching film, and I grew up more interested and more moved by what I saw on film and on TV than often what I saw in real life. There was definitely, and has always been, a sense of loneliness in me, both growing up and even today. A sense of not knowing quite how to fit into the world around you. A sense of not really connecting to anyone on a very close and intimate level. What I did connect to, however, growing up, and what I still connect to mostly, is what I see on film and TV. And I don't mean looking at film and TV as entertainment, because I believe there are some films out there that are purely that. They're purely there for you to forget about the world around you for an hour or two. But in my opinion, what good films do and what good TV does is really poke at you, poke at who you really are. And as Spielberg says quite nicely, he says good films can show you who you really are. They can act as a mirror to yourself. There's a really wonderful article that I read online, I can't find it, by Riz Ahmed and Bassam Tariq, who talk about how film is a shared space for both the believer and the non-believer. Not trying to misquote the article and hopefully not going against what they said, but the idea is that film is a space where everyone can kind of share who they really are, and then us as viewers go to this third space, this ethereal, intangible place that exists above our reality, and from that we grab things that we connect to and that resonate with us. And I think ultimately that's what loneliness is and where it stems from. It stems from not being able to fully understand yourself and not being able to fully understand the world around you. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because some of us, we look at the world very differently. We look at ourselves very differently. We're much more philosophical in the way we look at ourselves and look at the world. We're always asking questions. What is the world? What are we? Why do we exist? What is our purpose? Who am I? Who am I deep down? Definitely for me, growing up watching good film, good drama, good stories, you see human struggle. You see people trying to figure themselves out. You see people trying to figure their lives out. You see people trying to overcome anger, trying to overcome trauma, trying to reach places of self-forgiveness, trying to reach places of full contentment. And when you see that in film, definitely when I see that in film, and when it's communicated to me in a way that is intangible, it's not just spelled out for you, it's something you have to read between the lines and grab. It's something that perhaps the director or the writer or those behind the film might not have intended, but you, based on your experience, have taken from that piece of art, and you've taken a lesson, or you've taken a perspective that sits inside you dormant but has been awakened by what you've consumed, by what you've seen on film and TV, sometimes even through visuals, not even through storytelling or writing or dialogue. You know, Martin Scorsese being 80 years old and saying that he still needs to figure out who the hell he is definitely resonates with me as well. My whole life I've been asking who I am. My whole life I've been trying to figure out who I am deep down, and in unpacking that and understanding that, I am thus able to understand my place in the world and my role in the world and what I'm meant to do. What I'm trying to get at is that what's interesting about having this perspective and having this place that you ultimately create from, and having that, let's call it an origin story for a filmmaker or an artist or a creative, understanding why it is that the creative creates or the artist became someone who was entranced by art. I think when it comes from a place of loneliness, it's very interesting, because you, as someone who's grown up, let's say, lonely or not understanding the world or not connecting with people, you then look at the world a different way. You then look at reality a different way. And as a result, you're able to create art from a very different place. I've seen some really nice quotes from clerics who have kind of compared filmmakers to sages or philosophers. And I really feel like that's what they are. And it's so interesting because when you look at Martin Scorcese's biography and his life story, he says he was very close to joining the, I believe it was Catholic Church, and becoming a priest. But instead he decided to become a filmmaker, showing how much those two worlds are intertwined and how much they reflect each other. You know, you either become a man of God and you become someone who preaches religion, or you become someone who preaches stories through film. And I think what's so interesting is that when you study Scorsese's filmography, you find that his films are either about the worst of the worst when it comes to sin and indulgence, or the best of the best when it comes to faith. So for example, you have your Goodfellas and you have your Wolf of Wall Street, films that are just about, violence and killing and sex and drugs and basically succumbing completely to, let's call it the devil or this world, or whatever you want to call it. And then he also has films that are about faith. He has films like, for example, Silence, which is a phenomenal film which I can't recommend enough. You have, for example, his film on the crucifixion, The Last Temptation of Christ. So again, a film completely about religion in the most overt way possible. Flash forward today, you have films like The Irishman. The Irishman, billed as a gangster movie, really is about what? It's about what happens after you've lived that life of crime and everyone else is dead and you're just living out your last days. How do you look back on your life and deal with your ups and downs, the decisions that you made? And how do you live with those decisions as an old man who's in a completely different world where no one else understands you? And I think what's so interesting is that film is clearly a metaphor for Scorsese's own life. Someone who looks back on his life, on his filmography, and is asking himself, are you happy with what you've created? Are you content with meeting God with what you've created? Are you content with living in this world where everyone else around you is dead and you have to continue to live this life? Ultimately, the art that we create, the stories that we tell in our art, be they overtly films or TV shows or paintings or writing, whatever it is, are always going to be a reflection of our own experience, are always going to be us trying to find out who we are. And I think that those artists that come from a lonely place, that come from a place of trying to figure out what the world is, are very lucky. I do feel very blessed and very lucky that I can use my art not just to inspire others, but to find out who I am, to poke at myself, to figure out who lies there deep down beneath the soul. And I think ultimately those of us who are somewhat philosophical in our thinking will never truly understand who we are, no matter how much we poke at ourselves. But we are continuously on this journey in trying to figure out who we are and trying to figure out what our purpose is in this world, and trying to figure out why the things that happen to us happen, trying to figure out how we should interpret the events that happen to us, both positive and negative. And what's beautiful is that we can do that by creating art to reflect that. We can create art to try and discover ourselves. We can tell stories to try and discover ourselves. And in doing so, what happens is that we push art out there to those who might be lost, to those who might be lonely. And thus, our art becomes a mirror to those people to look at themselves, the same way that when we were growing up and when we interpret art, art is mirrored to us. And it's just one cycle, one ethereal cycle of people sharing themselves and other people seeing themselves in the art, and thus sharing themselves and others see themselves in their art, and on it goes. Hope you enjoy that. That was just some thoughts that I had. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Goodbye.